Welcome to my kitchen table lectures. Here's my recipe for your success. Okay, so one of the effects that of course we're very worried about in the UK is the threat of European law to parliamentary sovereignty. So let's give a little bit of background on what parliamentary sovereignty is and how it actually evolved in our law. Okay, going back to the beginnings of common law, you can remember that the main power was held by the king. He fulfilled all three functions of law and policy making, that of the executive, the legislative and the judiciary. And there was absolute power. The sovereign had absolute power in all those areas. But as time went on and the law modernised, there was a recognition that things needed to change. And the 17th century, mid-17th century, there we had a sort of conflict really between the power of the king and Parliament. And this was a key point, or this is a key point to note really on our road to democracy. Now, one of the first really important pieces of legislation that affected the power of Parliament was the Bill of Rights in 1689. And this act abolished the Crown's power of suspending laws, and laws then had to have the authorisation or agreement of Parliament. Okay, so this is a key point in changing the power from the absolute power of the king to the road to democracy and the power being held by Parliament. Now, together with that piece of legislation, we also had the Act of Settlement in 1700. And this gave the effect of judicial independence. And judicial independence relied on the power and authority of Parliament. So it also upheld the idea of the sovereignty of Parliament. Now you can see during this time that the UK really rejected the whole idea of autocratic rule and was working towards democracy. Dicey, one of our main commentators, said on parliamentary sovereignty that it has the right, Parliament has the right to make or unmake any law whatsoever. No person or body is recognised as having a right to override or set aside the legislation of Parliament. But Dicey did recognise that Parliament did have limitations on its power, that it wasn't the same kind of power that we associate with absolute power. And when we think of parliamentary sovereignty now, and we think about the fact that we have the executive, so we have political pressures on Parliament, and we also have the judiciary who are interpreting legislation, but there are other factors at play here. But of course, our main concern is, of course, the effect of EU law on parliamentary sovereignty. And two of the main pieces of legislation that have been said to really threaten our sovereignty is the European Communities Act of 1972 and Human Rights Act 1998. Right, let's first start with the European Communities Act 1972. This, many believe, was an important act for surrendering our parliamentary sovereignty to European law. And indeed, it allowed European law to be the prime source if it was an area that concerned European law, and would always override our UK law. And that's been upheld and proved to be the case in many cases that have gone to the European Court of Justice. For example, the case of factor time. So the European Communities Act is key to our understanding that parliamentary sovereignty has lessened. And this has been said to be in two ways. The first thing is that we have, within the Act, surrendered and said that we will comply with European law, that indeed is what we follow. But also within that Act, it also stipulates that any later legislation that's made in Parliament must apply and must comply with European legislation. Therefore, the legislation, European legislation in itself, of European Communities Act, has actually entrenched itself into our law, rather than just being an act. So it's more like a constitutional act. The second piece of legislation is the Human Rights Act 1998. And this has changed and is changing our law in the respect that it gives first of all, in the first instance, any legislation that is proposed must be examined in the context of human rights and to make sure that it can comply before it actually becomes legislation in Parliament. And human rights are also viewed through the judiciary. Therefore, if it's a right that involves human rights in the courts, then judges, if our law doesn't comply with the Human Rights Act, can issue a declaration of incompatibility. So our law is changing, and it's not necessarily law that is being passed directly through Parliament. So Parliament is being influenced by Europe. Now, what we need to do is we need to consider, when we're answering questions, a demonstration of this. So we need to consider several cases that are passed through the European Court of Justice. Factor time is one of the main ones. So please read page 110 of your notes from Mitchell, and you must back up everything you say with case law. Remind yourself of parliamentary sovereignty as well. Has parliamentary sovereignty got any limitations? Yes, it has. Parliament itself can't actually bind successive parliaments. It can't actually take back powers that it gives to devolved powers, such as the Welsh Assembly or Scottish. So it has got some limitations there. And so going back to what we were originally talking about, the absolute power that was associated with the king, and then that power being given to Parliament, Parliament has never really had an absolute power. There has always been influences on that power, which was recognised by Dicey in the late 1800s. So all questions, make sure, as far as parliamentary sovereignty is concerned, you can define parliamentary sovereignty. You can discuss its roots. You can discuss what you can do, so give a definition of what Dicey said about parliamentary sovereignty, and also that he recognised its limitations. Describe and explain what the acts, that is the European Communities Act 1972, the effect of that, and the Human Rights Act. Perhaps look back on your notes of rule of law and the judge's role in promoting the rule of law. Refer to the Human Rights Act section 3 and 4 on interpretation. And make sure that you include relevant case law to show how Parliament or how parliamentary sovereignty is threatened by past decisions. And for that, you'll need notes from Mitchell. Okay, we'll move on to the next subject now.